Well, it's a great pleasure to have all of you here. I should probably introduce myself. I'm Greg Treverton. I'm a new kid on the block. I started teaching in the School of International Relations in August, so it's great to be here. By those standards, General Petraeus is a veteran. He's been doing this for some time.
5 years now. Yeah.
So it's great to have him here and great to have this conversation with him. What I thought we'd do is have a conversation between the two of us for a while, and then we'll open it up to your questions and comments. I won't say a lot about David's background. As you know, he's a distinguished Army career. He was commander of CENTCOM, commander of ISAF, commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, then was director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and now has a distinguished career in private business. I can't resist as a first question, David, asking you, what surprised you most about the Trump administration?
It's a great question. First, let me just say what a pleasure it is, first of all, to be back on campus. Second, to be with all of you, and thanks for turning out in what I know is late in the semester, and you all have projects and papers that you are procrastinating over right now, and probably using this as an excuse to delay.
I see lots of my students out there, which is great.
And actually, it's a pleasure to be with Professor Treverton. I've known Greg since I was a very young major, and you may not remember, but we had the NATO at 40 conference at the U.S. Military Academy. I was the executive director of that thing, and we were so pleased when we got someone of his stature. And this is some 30 years ago or so. So he has done a lot since then, including most recently being the chairman of the National Intelligence Council, which is the organization for the Director of National Intelligence that produces the community analysis, the analytical decisions and judgments for the entire intelligence community. And of course, as director of the CIA, we had a great deal of input on that, but he oversaw all of the national intelligence officers for the different regional and functional areas. I think it was about 16 or 17 of them.
17 now, yeah.
Really quite an extraordinary position, and one that had to be, for someone who is always a student of the world, just a wonderfully stimulating position, and one I know that you did exceedingly well and earned a great reputation in doing, which is not always possible.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to talk about that when we have our Q&A period, if you'd like to. I like nothing better than talk about the National Intelligence Council.
So look, I think, if you ask me what surprised me most, and to be perhaps a tiny bit provocative, it might be that despite the tweets, despite the rhetoric, despite the occasional lack of what might be charitably termed message discipline, I would characterize the foreign policy that has emerged as more characterized by continuity than by change. In other words, just to give you an example, the most important relationship in the world, the U.S. and China. Candidate Trump was very critical of China over unfair trade practices, aggressive actions in the South and East China Sea, currency manipulation, inadequate actions relative to North Korea, you name it, just one after the other. President-elect Trump took a phone call from the Taiwanese president for the first time in 40 years for an American president or president-elect to do that, and then to add insult in a sense to that, then of course tweeted about it as well. But ultimately, President Trump, after a few weeks, called President Xi, embraced the one China policy, invited President Xi to Mar-a-Lago, had the Mar-a-Lago summit, chartered 4 working groups, has subsequently visited Beijing as the guest of President Xi, and actually said quite flattering things about the Chinese president, who is now more solidly in control of that country than any of his predecessors dating back to Chairman Mao, I would contend, and who has reached that level that only Chairman Mao did of having his thought enshrined in the Constitution in his own lifetime. Deng Xiaoping had to die before it happened. So that's just China. You can look at the two-state solution. You can look at the ultimate embrace of NATO after much criticism of freeloaders and so forth. You can look at the reassurance of our Japanese partners, Prime Minister Abe having played this very, very effectively. The first person at Trump Tower to congratulate the new president-elect, then his guest in Washington, subsequently hosts some very close relationships, and I've made a couple of trips to Japan in the last several months and confirmed that with their national security advisor, their foreign minister, and a variety of others. So I think, again, now you can say, what about trade? And yep, withdrew from Trans-Pacific Partnership, a very big deal, something that I argued shouldn't happen. Climate, pledged to withdraw from the Paris Accord in 2020, but has made some sounds that maybe that may not be impossible to return to. And by the way, back on trade, the NAFTA negotiations, bumpy, and you have to understand that, again, this is a president who truly does believe what he wrote in The Art of the Deal, which is that the way you should negotiate with someone is you punch the other guy in the nose before you even sit down at the table. And that is what he's actually doing repeatedly. But we'll see if they can come to the ultimate agreement. Because again, look, North America, Canada, and Mexico are our number 2 and 3 trading partners, China being number 1 now. So again, work your way down. Immigration, we really don't know yet, because the big issues aren't various forms of the so-called, as some have described it, Muslim bans. It's really about what do you do about the 12 million, quote, illegal aliens in our soil who are tax-paying, law-observing members of our country and their children, the dreamers. What do you do about a legal pathway for unskilled workers to the United States for the agriculture and hospitality industries, and how do you get more H-1B visas for the smart people to come to this country? Those haven't really been raised. So, but those areas are at least ones where there seem to be some change. I guess the one that someone might contend, I think accurately, where there is, again, potential change, because there's a degree of ambivalence here, but that is about whether or not the United States should continue to lead the rules-based international order, which we helped bring into existence in the wake of a 50-year period that included 2 world wars and the Great Depression. Is there still that sense of imperative for us to do that? And here it's mixed. Trump will sometimes say in the same speech, you know, we should continue to lead, we promote these values, et cetera. And then on the other hand, but again, we should do nation building at home, not abroad. So I think that's an area where there's still a degree of clarity that is needed. But if you come back to the policies, if you actually follow the troops, follow the money, and follow the substance, you'll see that our troops are going into Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. We're providing more money for European security initiatives. We're supporting NATO in its creation of 2 new headquarters that can actually help with the logistics and the maritime security for the new missions that we have, thanks to Vladimir Putin, the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War. And so, again, I think it's actually more continuity. And for what it's worth, in the fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, I think there have been some very wise decisions. I think that there was, the decision-making authorities had been pulled too high. I think that the devolution of some of the authorities, the allowance of use of air power in various ways that was restricted before, the provision of a modest increment of additional forces in Iraq and Syria, and a bit more substantial in Afghanistan, I think all of this was wise and appropriate. And that's, in a sense, a change that might not have been pursued by perhaps, although I think, frankly, Hillary Clinton would have done largely the same. So continuity.
So a lot of turmoil on the
change.
surface, but more continuity beneath the surface.
Yeah.
It is interesting that now he's been criticized some for having swung too far with President Xi and Putin being a little bit too deferential, maybe not tough enough, which is an interesting commentary.
Well, it is, and I think, again, it has shown that, not unlike all of the rest of us, he's a bit susceptible to being treated really well and reciprocating with kind words in response. I loved the one, though, where they said, he was shown the Great Wall, and you could see, man, how can they have this great wall? And we got that puny little thing down on the Mexican border.
Built it X hundred years ago is the right answer, right? Well, let me take you a little bit into intelligence, if I may. Mm-hmm. One of the things that's saddened me has been this constant harping, complaining about intelligence. I think it's gotten better. But here you have, 80,000 people who
Yep.
all think they work
Yep.
for the country,
Yes. Yeah.
not any party,
Yep.
who will do anything they can to help a president that's legal.
Yep.
And so it seemed to me really sad to kind of diss them.
Yeah.
That's changed a bit. I think the sheer complexity of the issues, Mr. Trump keeps saying, gosh, that's pretty complicated, right? And I think that's driven him to pay more attention. But
Certainly. Yeah. Again, the shots at the former leadership of the intelligence community is really, I think, what, and of course that's because of issues, sort of refusal to accept at face value the community assessment that Russia unquestionably set out to undermine our confidence in the election, in our democratic processes, and arguably to put a finger on the scales in favor of one candidate over the other.
that was the last paper I presided over at the
I
NIC.
thought it was, yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know that the entire community supported, the first part of what I said was high confidence, and the second part, I think, was confidence or moderate confidence or something like that, I think. So that's pretty high. That's a high bar to get over in the intelligence community for what it's worth. And this is a community that has had some extraordinary successes, but frankly, what people remember always is the intelligence failures, and has been burned by those failures, and is very cautious about assigning terms such as high confidence. That is a very big deal. And
It was a very odd paper to do because we ended up doing 3 different versions. We did an unclassified version, and then we did a secret compartment
Yeah.
intelligence version, and then there was one that was more highly compartmented than that.
Yep.
I was told as chair I could delegate 3 of my people into that compartment.
Yep.
And since I was about to leave, I didn't include myself. So I actually never read the final version of that highly compartmented paper. It was an interesting exercise.
well, inevitably, this is presumably, I can say this and I have no knowledge of it. I mean, this is about sources and methods.
Absolutely, yeah.
And, I do recall some of those, and some of those are obviously very sensitive.
What do you make of trying to do intelligence in a period like we're in, where truth seems to be subjective, malleable, there are false facts out there? It seems like a very strange time in which intelligence is operating. I can't think of anything better than to sort of double down and say that makes it all the more important for intelligence to try and come as close to the truth as it can, and say this is more than likely true and this is more than likely not true. But it's a very strange period.
Well, it's more that, again, folks won't accept facts, I think, is really the issue. I think facts are facts. Again, when the intelligence community says we have high confidence in a particular assessment, that means that it is, to the best of everyone's ability, very, very accurate. That doesn't mean that the community always gets it right. Before you actually were serving as the NIC, I think I'm the only military commander to have broken formally and completely on at least 3 national intelligence estimates. So the NIE, the NIE, is that's the big one. This is where the entire community comes together, argues usually for weeks over what the ultimate words are going to be. And then there are various forms of dissent. And it's not uncommon for one agency out of the, whatever, there's 16 or 17 agencies.
I can name them most of the time, but not all the time.
The ones that matter, candidly, are CIA, then, which does still 90+% of the presidential daily brief each day. It's actually still built in the CIA headquarters, signed off on and added to by the DNI's office, but it's really a CIA product largely. Then certainly NSA, then I guess NGA, and then it sort of drops off.
DIA and INR on some issues. Depends on the issue.
But on the issue of the surge in Iraq, as I prepared to go back for that 6-month testimony that was going to be so explosive and emotional, together with Ambassador Crocker, the greatest diplomat of his generation, I remember the intelligence community had to come in and give an assessment of where we were in the progress in the surge. And unfortunately, the intelligence community at that point in time used to sort of close the books on data something like 4 or 5 weeks in advance of actually publishing, hard copy production and distribution of the actual national intelligence assessment. Now, normally that's not a big deal. Things don't change that much in 5 weeks or not, but this was a very dynamic situation. And at the time they closed the books, we'd had something like 6 weeks or 7 weeks in which every week, with one exception, I think there was enormous progress in driving down the level of violence. And in the 5 weeks during which they argued over the wording and all the rest and got the editing right and so forth, it went down much further. So that by the time the ambassador and I were actually testifying, and by the time I had to submit my input to the White House, which I did directly, we'd had 8 of 11 weeks with a dramatic reduction of violence, something like 45% overall or 50%, which again is very statistically significant. And the NIE was very qualified, wasn't sure about the progress, it's unclear, and I said, this is not a case where I put in a footnote, which is one form. The next form is you can actually do an addendum or an annex or something like this and really lay it out. I said, I formally break with the entire assessment here. I think we have made much more progress than the assessment. And by the way, to be fair to the community, they had to shut the books on data 5 or 6 weeks ago so that they could go through the process. As you know, we compressed that process dramatically. DNI Clapper agreed, and I agreed. I think we tried to cut it down to under 3 weeks, and because there's no reason you can't do that. But then I broke again 6 months later and said they were too optimistic. It's too positive. And lo and behold, we had the Battle of Sadr City and the Battle of Basra and all that stuff. We ultimately won all of those, defeated the Shia militia. But so that's twice. And then one time in Afghanistan, where again, I felt that they really didn't capture the dynamics. That was a little bit more arguable, frankly. The 2 in Iraq, I think, were just demonstrably, and they actually agreed. Yeah. In fact, the DNI came out very quickly and said, okay, we got to fix this. How can we? That's where we dramatically expanded what was called the analysts in station.
Right.
So normally overseas, you have analysts coming and going. You don't have them embedded in the station in large number. I'm talking the analysts versus the actual human intelligence collectors or the operators. And so we dramatically increased the number of analysts who were actually deployed in stations for a year or more, sometimes longer. And that was a very, very salutary effect. You know, I said to them, why are you citing in your estimate, you know, a military review article, which is, you know, it takes them 3 months to just line up the articles, edit them and everything else, which was presumably based on, so you're talking 6 months old data at the freshest. Why don't you just come out? I mean, you want to write about the Iraqi security forces, you can embed with them, as we are. You can join the advisor team. We'll be fully transparent with you, but don't try to write it based on Washington Post articles and New York Times and so forth that may or may not capture the full effort that we have underway. So that was a pretty big breakthrough, actually. And then what was interesting, and this was somewhat unique, I said, look, this is the president's biggest overall endeavor. He's, in a sense, as we put later, he's gone all in on Iraq. This is, to a degree, he's staking his legacy on a surge that most of his senior advisors opposed. So he's consuming this, he's running this war. He took it over from Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld's gone. He and Gates are ramrodding the effort now for the first time. And I said, you're putting in front of him every day the presidential daily brief. Inevitably, there are 3 or 4 items on Iraq. I think that I ought to be able to at least review those with you. I'll turn it however quickly you have to do it. So these guys could walk in. They had walk-in right station chief, or the analysts could walk in, they'd look at it, and they wouldn't change it unless I was really persuasive for some reason. But at the very least, I knew what was going to be said. And frankly, I had an ability then through the chain of command, pretty short chain of command, frankly, to offer a different view if that was the case. It's very, very seldom the case. I mean, the analysts are tremendous, the operators are tremendous. Why would we disagree unless there's some kind of structural issue like closing the books 5 weeks before I had to hit the send key? But that was a very, very interesting period. I think I had the same thing in Afghanistan, but you didn't have a president that was driving it in the same way. It wasn't as dynamic. It wasn't as explosive and emotional. And that was a very interesting period.
I'm always struck by the tension between Washington and people in the field. And mostly I think that tension is creative. But sometimes you go to a deputies committee meeting in the White House and people are making distinctions in Washington that break down out there on the field. Other times you have operators out there who are understandably optimistic, can do, proud of what they're doing. And then you have the analyst in the position of asking hard questions like, well, is this really accomplishing anything? It looks good, but is it accomplishing anything solid?
I think there's a real tension there, and I think you have to be careful not to get captured and go native and all these things. I mean, I had this big challenge with our advisor teams. To some degree, we're obviously doing evaluation reports on, the colonel in charge of an advisor team, and all these others, by how well their Iraqi unit or Afghan unit does. But, what if they're dealt a lousy hand? How do you evaluate someone? What if they have a lousy Iraqi leader and we just can't quite get rid of the guy? I mean, some of them we clearly would, but if he's just okay, how do you do that? And understandably, the advisor teams, having given a year of their life, or 15 months as we did during the surge when we extended the tours, they get sort of attached to this. Needless to say, they see reflected in that unit their ability. And so it's sort of understandable that they'll start out with a low opinion of the unit, and inevitably it tends to grow a bit over it. And you have to really challenge that and try to be as objective as you can, but it's very difficult to do, understandably. And then those in Washington have learned in the intelligence community, you can never go wrong if you're pessimistic. No, truly. I mean, if you are pessimistic and wrong, nobody really cares because it turned out better than you said, so everybody's happy. If you're pessimistic and right, you were truly prescient, and you were had great analytical and intellectual qualities.
It does introduce a certain bias, I fear. Yes.
Well, it does, and I think the community has been burned a couple of times by somewhat, again, over-enthusiastic or over-optimistic assessments.
The line about having predicted 6 of the last 2 coups, right, is the typical one.
That's exactly right.
Well, let me ask you one more about intelligence.
Sure.
You've been around intelligence your whole life. You had the chance to run the CIA, and maybe you've had this chance. But if you were talking to Mr. Coates, the DNI, what would you tell him? What should he work on? What should he fix?
I have talked to Mr. Coates, the DNI. I sat down with him, and it was something I was working on with the DNI. I was a director of the CIA, and actually with Bob, who's now the head of NGA, when he was the deputy director for immigration, Robert. What I said was, you've got to get the big ideas right for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, because we've never really done that. And if you ever looked at the organizational memo, was signed by, I think, the first DNI. There's been about 4 or 5 of them since then. And we were working on updating this. And so I said, one of the principles has to be that you have to be super lean. Keep in mind that what you're doing is you're at the level, the NIOs that work for you are grading the work of other people. But if you pull all the talent up to the level of grading work and leave nothing to do the work, you've got a problem. What about the actual career paths for these individuals? Can we cycle to NIO and then back to the agency, i.e. to the CIA, which again is the source of many of the national intelligence officers? I actually said, frankly, this is a bit arcane, but they created something new called a national issue manager. Now, these are the people. They didn't want to hurt the feelings of the national intelligence officers for these different regions. They did. But the NIM is put on top of them, the National Issue Manager. The NIM goes to the White House and gives the assessment of the community. The NIO goes to the NIC. They didn't always see world the same way. This is very disturbing. And I said, look, you need to say, just pick a name. I don't care whether it's NIM, NIO, or whatever it is, but whatever title that is, the other person is the deputy. You can't have 2 sort of co-equal people who have slightly different views. The person on top is the best athlete in that particular arena, and that's the person that should go to the White House. It's also, frankly, I think the person that should go to the NIC, unless he or she is at the White House, in which case the deputy represents the community views established by this person at the NIC or at the White House. I was very uncomfortable with and it also tended to mushroom just the sheer number of people that were being pulled from below. So there was a real issue there that sounds, again, very arcane and not that meaningful. It's hugely meaningful. There's only so much talent, right, and it takes decades to build the really talented people, and it's a huge winnowing process. And you don't want to suck all those up to the higher headquarters, again, just basically grading the work of the people that are actually down there in the galleys doing the rowing and actually doing the first drafts.
I spent a lot of time on what one of my deputies called the black suburban problem, that
yes,
being who got to go to White House meetings.
Yeah, yeah.
And we finally decided that most of the time, most of the White House meetings were about substance. If they were about collection or other intelligence basics, then the NIM would go. But if it was about substance, the NIO would go. But it took some wrangling to get there.
Yeah, I mean, again, this sounds arcane.
It is arcane.
But frankly, it actually matters because but what you have to do is get the big ideas first. And we had a whole series of big ideas, and then if you then implement those big ideas, the structure sort of falls out logically. And I think the way you operationalize those is a more rational method of managing people, developing them, and all the rest of this. So those are among the issues that I chatted about with him. The other is, I had to remind him that the Director of National Intelligence does not oversee covert action. The CIA director, by law, still reports directly to the president, usually through the National Security Advisor, on covert action. That's a big deal because most of what we're doing overseas is, a fair amount of it is under some heading, some finding, that then it gives you the authorization, the legal foundation for conducting the operations that you are. And so I had the agreement with the DNI that I'd keep him informed on that, but I wasn't seeking his approval or disapproval. But we certainly wanted to keep him informed. And look, if he raised an issue, then that's fine. The other, by the way, is an interesting one. And this seems arcane, but it's hugely significant. The station chiefs overseas, keep in mind that human intelligence collection in the United States is overseen by the FBI. They have primacy. So even in the cases where you have CIA domestic stations, which are publicly known to exist, they work under the FBI. Overseas, it's the other way around. The CIA is in charge of human intelligence collection operations, and of course the CIA has a station chief in each country. That station chief is also the DNI representative. Right. So he's, in a sense, working for the CIA and also for the DNI, and it's with the DNI hat that he oversees all of the other intelligence community members that are satellited in that particular station. And so we had an agreement. This is where, of course, the previous DNI to DNI Clapper was allowed to resign, DNI Blair,
right,
who clashed with Leon Panetta, my predecessor, on who got to pick a station chief. And at the end of the day, it wasn't the senior intelligence officer in the cabinet, it was the CIA director who won. Never try to, Leon Panetta's a pretty clever, he's been around the block once or twice, including chief of staff of the White House and on Capitol Hill.
Well, Jim Clapper learned that lesson. He wasn't about to pick a fight with John Brennan. So.
And he and I agreed before John that the CIA would select the individual. The DNI could approve or disapprove, but it wasn't going to pick someone else. Again, but there was the bottom line is, can't we all just get along? Yeah. I mean, and the truth is, more important actually even than the architecture is actually the DNI and the CIA director foremost among all the relationships in the community getting along well and working together to the same objective. But the importance of the CIA director reporting directly is reflected in the fact that he's the only agency head within the community who's actually at the table, at the Situation Room table in the White House. And it's not there because he's to give the additional intelligence analysis. The DNI will do that. They might ask you for it if they think you have some expertise in, say, Iraq or Afghanistan. But you're really there because of covert action.
Right.
And a fair amount of what goes on overseas is indeed under one of the headings of covert action.
That seems to have worked pretty well, that arrangement, dual hatting the station chief. I think that's
Very much so. With DNI Clapper, it worked very well, and I'm sure it will with DNI Coates. Again, my sense from the conversations that I had with him, I mean, what you need is the DNI is somebody who's a very secure individual, who's very confident. He's not threatened by some agency that does report directly, even if it's by law. Not trying to, he's trying to shepherd, he's trying to oversee, to guide, certainly to run. But again, you've got very senior people, and what you need to do is get everyone working together and use that leadership style that's appropriate to each one of those to get the most out of each individual.
Yeah, I thought Jim Clapper, as DNI, his style was interesting and appropriate. I think he'd learned or seen the mistakes some of his predecessors had made. You can't command these 17 agencies. So basically he'd say, here's where we need to go, community. And you tell us, you agencies, tell us how we're going to get there.
Yeah, no, he's terrific.
So when he was trying to move IT to the cloud, he then turned to the agencies most conscious about security, CIA and NSA, and said, you build a cloud that you're satisfied with, and we'll all take it.
No, that's exactly right. And I thought he did a very, very good job in that regard. And again, guided the community very effectively. Frankly, people ask me, what do you think of the Intelligence Reform Act? Because, of course, remember that prior to the post 9/11 period and the intelligence reform, you had the CIA director was also the director of Central Intelligence. So he was DCI/DCIA. With the latter hat, he ran the CIA. With the former hat, he ran the community. He was essentially the DNI and the CIA director together. And he had a separate staff to do some of this. I said, I'm delighted to have a DNI. I am delighted not to have to be the director of Central Intelligence. I think there's more than enough work. And what I frankly got most excited about was, chasing bad guys, stealing secrets, and recruiting sources. I mean, that's what the CIA does legally.
And indeed, most DCIs concentrated on running the CIA,
on the community process on this or that. These are not unimportant. The community budget, and actually, what the other great thing about DNI Clapper was, you realize I don't need the director of the CIA to come to every budget meeting we have. You send the person that does that at the CIA, and that's fine. And he said, I'll let you know when I really do want you at a meeting, and then I would really be there. But otherwise, he was very comfortable having, there's a huge world out there, and the CIA is, again, in charge of human intelligence collection operations throughout that entire world outside the United States.
Well, let us open it up to questions and comments. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, raise your hand, but wait for the microphone. We're trying
Let
to
me
get this
give
on
one
tape.
bit of advice, if I
Absolutely.
could. For those, just out of curiosity, how many are just at all interested in being in the intelligence community, just out of curiosity? Yeah, that's the reason. Let me give you a bit of advice. What you should do if you are not yet a senior is try to be an intern. Believe it or not, there are college interns inside the CIA. There's quite a number of them. I got to know them because I had a program called Run with the Director, which I foolishly thought everyone would be inspired to come out and go running with me. I had the problem.
You're
was
too
there,
hard. You're too fast.
There was a prerequisite because I wanted to get a workout in. This is my run, and so I said, please don't come out unless you can run 6 miles in 42 minutes or better. So do so, and because that's about the pace that and that was a talking pace. And so, I realized I'm getting to know I wanted to get to know the mid-level people because I knew the senior folks, we worked with them in the military or now had them around the morning table. I swear in all the new people and have dialogue with them. I want to get to know the middle people who've been there for a while, the up-and-comers. So that was a real bust, although I did get to learn a lot about the college intern programs. And, it takes literally a year to get through the process of getting a clearance. You might as well start sooner rather than later. And it's a tremendous program and gives a huge leg up, especially if you're trying to go to the CIA, where there's usually somewhere between 100 and 150 people applying for each vacancy.
I think we have a couple. If anybody who's been an intern, is an intern now.
Do we have an intern?
Yeah, we have at least one. I guess
if you are an intern, please stand up and tell us what a wonderful experience it has been.
JD.
So I interned for the CIA, two terms, one of which was this summer. So
Fantastic. Have you enjoyed it?
exactly like what you said. So
But did you ever run with the director?
yeah, I had one of those with Banana. Yeah, I would just echo what you said, that it's a good chance to try it out, and you can decide whether to go back or not. And
Yeah.
the benefits are really good, like you get paid and stuff. So.
Being paid is nice. That's good. That's good.
Never discount getting paid.
Right,
There's some value there.
Okay, who's questions?
Questions. Right up here, please.
Rob here in the front.
Thank you. I have a question about the intersection of organizational and substantive issues in intelligence. And I'm thinking about the emergence of the Arctic as an arena of greater and greater geopolitical concern. If you in the intelligence community have a European issue or an Asian one, you have specialist training programs, and presumably people who specialize in Europe all know about the economy, something about the military, all the things that are drawn in. If you need an Arctic specialist, I look around and there are people who know the environment and know nothing about Coast Guard issues. There are people who know the business side and know nothing about naval issues. So when you within the intelligence community decide that this is a growing arena of interest, but you don't have the automatic European affairs or Asian affairs, how do you train people? Do you create a new committee or subdivision? And how do you get that joint expertise when it's not on offer from the normal academic community or other preparation?
Let me give a parochial answer and then I'll turn it to David. At the NIC, what we did basically is for a long time, in the old NIC, in the old days when we were in the foreign intelligence business, there was a blank spot where the United States would be, right? Now we're in the intelligence business, sort of tiptoeing into including the United States in our assessments, but now the National Intelligence Officer, who would have been Latin America before, is now Western Hemisphere. And it was a he in this case, had a deputy who did cover the Arctic. She was new to it, but she learned a lot. So at least we had somebody who was systematically following and trying to draw the threads together. As you say, lots of the expertise is outside government, but you also want the Coast Guard to be a player and be involved. So that was really her role, was to try and integrate both the information and the various agencies that cared about the Arctic.
And again, generally, if you have, in a sense, what might be termed an intellectual shortcoming or an inadequate coverage of a particular region or functional area, you are inevitably going to invest in people, and then you're going to make the organizational adjustments that are necessary to elevate that. It's publicly known, for example, there is what's the new office that was just formed? Was it
in the CIA or in the DDI?
Well, no. That was just taken from the analysis. So again, you have a real focus.
Well, this is the Directorate for Digital Innovation.
Well, that's one of them. Yeah, so we decided to. We did an exercise when I was the director of the CIA where we went through, and it was very open, very transparent, completely welcomed input from the workforce, and I think we got in the first weekend alone, created a SharePoint website. Basically, the question was, what are the enduring missions of importance, and what are the emerging missions in which we need to put additional resources? And of course, everything digital was one of the latter. Believe it or not, we felt that we needed to do more in the human capital arena as well. But we had one when we kept getting asked, what will the price of Brent crude be after the next round of sanctions on Iran? And ultimately, on my watch, we created something called the Economic Security Center. We pulled together, we had tremendous energy economists, it turned out. Some of them had been doing this for over 30 years. They were spectacular. And by the way, the agency got it right, the projection. Now, we had inside information. I was the guy who was tasked to go to the Saudis and ask them to pump the additional 1 million barrels that they were holding off the market. But we shared that with everybody else. The difference was that we believed that they would actually do it, and Treasury, Commerce, and Energy weren't quite so certain that they would. So, but again, we had great expertise. Just go about it. It's a usual problem. Let's build aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves that are very, very rigorous, very detailed. Let's determine what kind of disruptions already exist or keeping oil off the market. What are disruptions that could prevent some of the oil going to market that is currently there. So again, it's a very straightforward economics problem. As a former professor of economics, I loved it. And we had a lot of fun with that. But again, we had an organizational solution as well as investing more in the human capital. By the way, we brought in all the energy economists. By the way, most of whom were shooting behind the target repeatedly when it came to assessing what was happening with the U.S. energy revolution. That was the period where we were watching energy production in the U.S. having gone from what was termed peak oil. But even Dan Yergin, who I just think the world of, and I think has spoken out here, Pulitzer Prize winner at least once. And so I would actually host dinners. So we would have themes. Everybody wants to come to dinner in the director's dining room at CIA. It's great bragging rights. But to do that, you first had to do 2 sessions with our analysts, and then we'd have a dinner at which would have a couple of young people as well as the normal senior deputy directors. And I enjoy that very, very much. So that was part of our process. We did it on the Euro crisis, we did it on counterinsurgency, just every topic you can imagine. Because I was always trying to build or to refresh my own intellectual capital. I mean, that's what you do as the director of the CIA, is you are consuming and constantly just trying to stay as current as you can on what is going on in the world. It's an extraordinary position, really great fun. And you're doing operations as well, and I had some knowledge about how to do those.
Michael.
Hi there. With the rise in power and influence of the private sector, do you see over the coming years more collaboration with the intelligence community, or maybe more desire for the intelligence community to actually keep the private sector out of decision making?
I think what the intelligence community likes to do with the private sector, frankly, and actually the private sector likes to do with the intelligence community, is to compare notes. And there are, my first encounters, maybe not the first ones, but with Henry Kravis, for example, the co-founder of KKR, where I'm now a partner. I mean, he just had this, as most businessmen do, quite an insatiable curiosity about the world. At that time had, I don't know, $70 or $80 billion that we were trying to invest around the world. It's now nearly 160. And it is actually why we created the KKR Global Institute. So I built the geopolitical risk element of that, partnered it with the macroeconomic analysis and the environmental social governance issues analysis for examination of the deals that we're doing. So again, whether you're investing money or conducting a national security policy, you want to understand what is going on in a particular country. You're evaluating its rule of law, again, its environmental, social governance issues. What about the macroeconomic conditions? And at the end of the day, what about the fundamental security risks that country or a part of a country might face? And I think, again, the private sector is that's what they do. It's also what the intelligence community does. And oftentimes there's a very good collaboration. They're not doing anything illegal at all. We're not asking them to do that. They are just, again, trying to ensure that their feel is the same as our feel, or if it's not, that they understand why that might be.
Yeah, one of the nicest things about the NIC was that we had a program called the Intelligence Community Associates, about 200 of them, mostly from academia, but from think tanks and other places, and it was wonderful. They were on kind of call. You could consult them informally if they'd taken an interesting trip. We also asked them if they were willing to write a paper for you. Most of them didn't have security clearances, so it was all unclassified. But it was really a nice way of both checking our work and getting inputs from outsiders to government. We then supplement that with, I would go to New York about twice a year when I was chair and do the rounds of the big financial houses. Again, sharing notes, I think was useful to both sides. But that was the NIC is pretty outward facing, and that was good because the things, if you're trying to look out more than a year or two, as we've talked about in class, none of that classified stuff helps you very much. You really need to be in touch with the experts, the people who are thinking about the future, who are trying to, in some cases, making big bets on the future. That's really, and I found that really a rewarding piece of the work.
You know, there are people in the private sector now, some have always been in the private sector, except maybe serving in the military or something like that have more experience with Chinese leaders for some 40 or 50 years than certainly do the analysts. It was similar when the analysts would come into me and say, well, sir, today, Director, we're going to brief you on Iraq. I say, good luck. And they say, well, we're going to do the psychoanalysis of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. I'd say, well, great. You know, how many times have you met with him? So again, there are people that, you know, think of the Henry Kissingers of the world and who have encyclopedic recall and memory and nuanced understanding. I mean, there's no one better on the history and the evolution of China or Russia than Henry Kissinger. So being able to sit down with him, just as the Council on Foreign Relations wants to sit down with him and everybody else in the world. We've made a business out of it, and they didn't even make us pay him. That kind of, you know, Hank Greenberg founded AIG, built it in China, an extraordinary expert again on China. Been going out there probably 3-4 times a year. He's 94 years old and he's still going out there 3 or 4 times a year. There's no analyst in the CIA that has that breadth of contact, the history, the sense of how it has all evolved. So I think there's a great partnership. Now, I will tell you that there can be challenges if, say, the IT community is assisting in a certain way and then is outed by a Snowden. And that was a huge blow to the relationships between those in the internet services provider community, social media platforms, and so on. And it took several years to rebuild those relationships and, again, to make sure that everybody was working reasonably together, again, within the framework of the law. I mean, these are not people that are sliding stuff to you. But that was very, very tough. And frankly, there are issues now that are seriously difficult involving encryption of apps like, WhatsApp and Telegram, I think is another one, which the extremists use and so forth. And that whole issue, and, you know, my personal view is that we should not be able to compel manufacturers of IT devices to create a backdoor for law enforcement or intelligence community use, even if you have a legal basis for that, because the bad guys are going to find it. Having said that, I also believe that we ought to be able to crack everything that is out there, but we just shouldn't talk about it.
Yeah, in that sense, I think Apple did itself and the whole tech community a disfavor by its position, because I think you're exactly right. If there's a warrant and they can get the stuff, then they should. If they absolutely can't, and we're getting to a period of encryption when they really won't be able to be, then that's fine. But in principle, the principle ought to be if you have the proper legal authority, they should try and get the information out if they can. You're right, certainly right about a backdoor. That's we've been through that before 20 years ago with Clipper chip, and it was a bad idea then, and it's still a bad idea now, and certainly not, I think, not going to happen.
Please.
Oh,
yes,
sorry.
Tom Anthony from the Viterbi School. We have seen the Office of the President have an ennobling and a maturing and improving effect on normal, ordinary men since World War II. And the question is, has the introduction of this instant media, has that threatened to challenge, or has that threatened the role of the Office of the President sort of raising the individual to act more presidential?
Look, social media were used before. The White House used to put out tweets. It would put out blogs. It would put out press statements and everything else. I think it's really how you are using it more than the advent of it. I think if you go back and look at the Obama administration, They were putting out maybe not as many tweets, and perhaps it wasn't in the name of or it wasn't the president himself, but people were putting out tweets in the president's name, in the name of the White House. It's just that they weren't quite so interesting as have been the ones over the last 10 months.
Interesting is a good word for it.
Interesting as a euphemism.
In some cases, certainly, yeah. No, as I mentioned earlier, there's occasionally been a bit of a lack of message discipline.
One commercial message. The other last paper I got to preside over was the Unclassified Global Trends, which came out in January. And we subtitled it The Paradox of Progress. And I think one of the big paradoxes is that all this great IT stuff that was designed to connect people now segments them, now lets them live in their own little echo chambers and hear only what they already knew or already liked. And that is, I think, and I don't see kind of an end to that either, and it does worry me very much as we go forward.
And we all consciously or subconsciously, I think, we tend to subscribe to feeds, if you will, as we term them. These, again, this newspaper or that TV channel or whatever, or we watch either Fox or MSNBC, or again, I think there's a degree to which that does tend to amplify or magnify the views that someone holds. Actually, it's also, you see this in patterns of movement of population. And that is exacerbated by gerrymandering, which thankfully the state of California is figuring out how to take on.
My question for you is about the difficulties of achieving and articulating shared goals when you're limited by restricted information. Because the majority of your career has been dealing with the tricky situation of classified information. So first, how does a leader like yourself and the future leaders of this room ensure those that are in lower classification levels implement a plan successfully based on material and reasoning that they might not be aware of? And second, how has that challenge differed from the various positions you've held over your career?
I am not sure that's as big an issue as you might think. In fact, I tried not to fall back on the old, when all other arguments have failed, you say, well, if you knew what I knew, you'd agree with me. Frankly, especially in a world of so much open source intelligence as it's termed, the CIA actually has an open source intelligence center, actually just changed that name, but it runs it for the DNI. Right. Again, CIA administers it. Yeah, you might get something that's a nugget. Certainly sometimes there are extraordinary sources or methods that are sort of holy cow moments. But generally, the analyses on which you are basing strategies and tactics and operational campaign plans, there's not something that's so super secret that you can't reveal it, but causes you to change your entire approach. Occasionally there might be something where you want to give an order, you need to do this, but there's a compartmented program that's the basis for it. And you can certainly say that. People will understand that. If you think about the challenge with so-called Ultra during World War II, they had to sort of launder that through the system. They're getting incredible, they're getting the instructions from the German high command to the submarines or to forces, and they then had to make operational decisions based on those without giving away the fact that they were basically reading the mail being sent out from Berlin. That's very doable. And again, the folks down on the receiving end are not necessarily clamoring for, okay, tell me again, why are we? So I actually think that's less of a problem nowadays. I mean, just the sheer leakage of stuff and everything else. There's very little that I can think of that was just such an incredible nugget that it would lead you to do something very profoundly different from what you would do if you didn't have that nugget.
A piece of this that I bumped into pretty often was really the proliferation. Again, this is arcane but important. the proliferation of special compartments. So if we tried to have a meeting on Iran's nuclear program, who could be in the room and who couldn't became a big issue. Because everybody had the same security clearance at the top level, but not all were cleared into these special compartments. And that was a hindrance in doing analysis. I think it didn't have the leadership effect you were talking about, but it did make it harder to do.
And again, you have
analysis.
to be conscious of who can actually discuss this and that kind of stuff. But because again, there are some very, very sensitive capabilities and sources that, I mean, don't believe those who say the CIA can't recruit human sources anymore. It just depends on what it can get from satellites or something. That's complete nonsense. But I never really found that to be a big issue. And again, at the top level, you're generally doing strategic. You know, when I was a 4-star commander in Iraq, Central Command, Afghanistan, we're talking about big strategic issues here. We're not doing tactical operations. And if we had some real nugget, we'd hand it off to the Joint Special Operations Command for verification and targeting, if it's that kind of nugget. But people, I think, don't understand that, you know, the CIA director is not actually looking at a predator feed all that often. The only time I ever actually did that I can remember, even having authorized some very significant operations, I mean, there are people, they know the criteria, they know the conditions. If the conditions are met, you take a certain action. The one night that I did watch was the night of Benghazi. And it's publicly known that a predator was out there and it was moved over the action. And the challenge there was that you couldn't understand what you were seeing. And because you didn't have a narration, we didn't have a baseline. We hadn't been over that endlessly. And somebody could say, there's the guy with the limp, and no, that vehicle is a good guy. And actually during that night, there were some units, host nation forces, as you will, that I think may have actually even changed sides once or twice. So it's a very confused picture. And you could see guys with guns, this and that and everything else, but you weren't really certain without somebody giving you a full time, you're just basically watching a picture through a soda straw.
My question kind of corresponds more to your time as commander in Afghanistan. I'm curious to know, now that the Trump administration has announced that it can envision having kind of the Taliban incorporated in some elements of political leadership in the country, what your take is on that and how that incorporation could look like specifically.
Sure. Let me actually start just by maybe, it's always good to recall why we went to Afghanistan, why we've stayed. And we went there, of course, because that's where Al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks in a sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan that was allowed by the Taliban, who were controlling most of the country at that time. It's where the initial training of the attackers took place. And we went into Afghanistan initially to eliminate that sanctuary, and then we stayed to ensure that it's never reestablished. Obviously, what we'd like to do is get the Afghan forces to a point where they can secure the country and govern the country to an Afghan good enough standard that that sanctuary is not reestablished. And obviously that has been very, very challenging for a whole variety of different reasons. The difficulties in Afghanistan are enormous, and I actually one time went over to Afghanistan. My reward, Secretary Rumsfeld would give interesting rewards. So my reward for doing a reasonable job as a 2-star in Iraq was to go back to Iraq and do an assessment of what went wrong in some other units during a particular Shia uprising. This is where I was still a 2-star. Then to come home, give up this great command of the 101st Airborne Division early, and go back to Iraq as a 3-star and implement what it is I laid out. At the end of my 3-star time in Iraq, which was 15 and a half months that time, he says, "This is really great, you've done great work. Why don't you come home through Afghanistan?" I said, "That's not the most direct route back to the States, but okay." So he did an assessment over there. And the first slide in the briefing that I gave to him after getting back to the States was titled, "Afghanistan does not equal Iraq." And then a whole series of factors, much less literate, no comparable source of external revenue. I mean, Iraq, if you get the pipelines working, it's $100 billion a year. Afghanistan could barely scrape $1 billion out of various customs duties and other taxes and so forth if they were lucky. And the biggest one, of course, is that the headquarters of the enemy are outside the country in which we're authorized to operate. The Taliban are in Baluchistan, in that province of Pakistan, and the Haqqani network, Al-Qaeda, Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, are in North Waziristan of the federally administered tribal areas. And we really have very limited abilities and authorizations to go after them. So there's a whole bundle of issues, not to mention the lack of infrastructure, the lack of strong governance, the fact that in Afghanistan the major export crop is illegal. It's illegal narcotics. It's very hard to have rule of law if your major export crop is illegal. So again, a lot of challenges. Now, what do you do about the enemy? And I'm one who said you can't kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency, and I believe that. And so what we did in Iraq, of course, was called reconciliation. It was really, in Afghan terms, what we term reintegration in Afghanistan. What you're basically trying to do is strip away the rank and file to the extent that you can, maybe up to middle leaders, and then you reconcile with them and bring them over onto your side, provide them incentives to support the new Iraq or the new Afghanistan rather than to oppose it. And on the other hand, more aggressively pursue the irreconcilables, the leaders of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the leaders of the Taliban, Haqqani, Al-Qaeda that are in Afghanistan and so forth. In Afghanistan, that was termed reintegration. And on the scale there, we got maybe 25,000 that we truly reintegrated after a fashion, some of whom went back to evil stuff after a while. By comparison, in Iraq, somewhat bigger country to be sure, but we reconciled with 103,000, 80,000 Sunni Arabs and 23,000 Shia Arab former militia members. So we never could get that kind of critical mass, in part because we couldn't go after the senior leaders who are living outside the country with reasonable amounts of funding from a variety of illegal activities inside Afghanistan and in Pakistan in some respects, surrounding the illegal narcotics effort, kidnapping for ransom, and a variety of other activities. So that's a real challenge. I was a little bit concerned by the sort of facile mention of this, if you will, that, okay, now all of a sudden we're going to be able to reconcile with the Taliban. I strongly supported Ambassador Richard Holbrooke when he was pursuing that, but I said, Richard, I have done this stuff for a living, and so had he, to be fair, and he'd done the Dayton Accords, to be more fair, but I'd done reconciliation in Iraq. I said, this is going to be very, very tough to truly flip Afghanistan. We are not going to be able to flip Afghanistan the way we flipped Iraq. The conditions are just completely different. And keep in mind, again, you're not just dealing with the Taliban. The Haqqani network, or the Haqqani Taliban as they're sometimes termed, are every bit as evil and bad and probably responsible for more of the suicide attacks in Kabul than are perhaps the mainstream Taliban. And there's others, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, Hekmatyar's former group, they did reconcile. By the way, one of the final meetings I had was with former warlord Hekmatyar's, I think it was his son-in-law, or it was an English-speaking individual who was a surrogate for Hekmatyar. It took 4 years, I think, or 5 years to actually get that done. So I think we have to be very, very measured about what is possible on the reconciliation front. And I think we have to recognize that we're going to be engaged in Afghanistan for a very long time to come. I've said that the fight against Islamist extremists, sort of globally, is a generational endeavor, not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. You'll make progress in some areas. You'll actually be able to dramatically reduce in some, but you're going to have to keep going in a variety of others, and you have to go after them wherever they are. You cannot whack-a-mole just to have them pop up somewhere else. You've got to whack all the moles all the time, everywhere. That's actually doable because of the way we've been able now, using these capabilities that we have built and developed during the surge in Iraq and Afghanistan, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms that we have, precision strike assets, and the industrial strength ability to fuse intelligence. These are quite unique to the United States. If you take all of the other Predator and Reaper equivalents around the world, I think we probably have 6 times the number of all of our allies and partners put together, and very few of them will use them to shoot. Will shoot from those platforms, which we will, in addition, obviously, to collecting a variety of different forms of intelligence. So I certainly think it's a worthy cause to continue the effort to reintegrate members of the Taliban who are inside Afghanistan, but recognize that reconciliation with the senior leaders of the Taliban who have views that are diametrically opposed to those in the Constitution of Afghanistan is likely to have a slim likelihood.
This may be in your category of always safe to be pessimistic, but we were pretty pessimistic about reconciliation. We continually assessed that the Taliban basically was convinced in the end it could win. And therefore what it meant by reconciliation was a kind of veneer for capitulation by the government.
No, I couldn't agree more with you. And again, it was, this is one of those aspects of being, what do they call it, the skunk at the garden party or something like that, where you say, look, Richard, I'll support you in any way we can. We did. We flew in bad guys. We took care of, we had all kinds of covert and clandestine activities to support efforts at reconciliation. We even, of course, helped Qatar. The reason Qatar has the Taliban leaders is because we asked them to take them there, some of the old Taliban leaders, so that we had a place where we could talk with them. But again, I couldn't see the incentive structure ever to be, again, in Iraq, there were some very clear incentives. You can reconcile or you can get killed or captured. If you reconcile, you have a place in the new Iraq. Over a period of months, after a while, we figured out how we could even pay them by giving their sheikhs courses on how to compete for defense contracts for fixed site security, which we needed a lot of. And it worked out, and it was a bargain. But we didn't buy our way out of that, as some folks have said. Petraeus bought his way out of this problems in Iraq. I mean, it was a lot more than that. It was a huge, comprehensive civil military campaign. Involved a lot of different activities.
I think we probably just have time for one more. Monica? But maybe you can stay for a few minutes afterwards.
Sure.
If you...
Yep.
General, you mentioned before the military aid that the U.S. is sending to Eastern Europe right now. And coming from Lithuania myself, I was wondering to what extent would that be an actual commitment of the U.S. to intervene in case the war did break out, let's say in the Baltic countries? And to what extent is it an actual threat today, considered by American intelligence and international community? And do you believe that this comes due to historical reasons? And will it go away with when the Putin administration goes away, or will it always remain a threat for the Baltic countries and Eastern Europe to be re-annexed?
I think this is largely driven by Putin. Putin believed, when he said in the last century that the worst day of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He has sought to reassemble as many of the pieces of that Soviet Union as he could, and if not to make them actual sort of Russian republics again, at least to have a security arrangement or an economic arrangement or an intimidation arrangement, whatever the case may be. And to further that, he has created the Eurasia Economic Union. It's a pale carbon copy of the EU. He's created a security arrangement with Central Asian states and some others that's not all that significant, but it does have some value. It does keep them looking towards Moscow, perhaps rather than to other places. He has invaded a couple of countries, Georgia, Ukraine, left troops on the soil of another, Moldova, sought to intimidate others, the Baltic states, including a denial of service attack on the most connected country in the entire world, which is Estonia. It's not Estonia. It's so connected that it now has rented from Luxembourg sovereign Estonian territory in which it has a server and switch farm with all of the data duplicated that it has to run. Because in Estonia, they basically jumped right over analog telephony. They never had one of those because the Soviet Union, it was so hard to get a telephone. And a Nordic country offered it to them. They said, we'll give you our telephone system if you want it. They said, no, forget about that. We're going to go right to mobile devices. In those days, it was pretty simple cell phones. Now, obviously, mobile telephones, and you can perform every function. You can pay your taxes by your mobile phone. You can vote on a mobile phone. Every function that government does essentially is performed in that way. And they're pioneers in a variety of different cybersecurity arrangements, including blockchain technology. In any event, Russia has threatened a number of these countries to the point that they requested the deployment of NATO forces on their soil. That has continued with the Trump administration. And frankly, I think that you'll see more money under this administration than you would have seen under the previous administration for a variety of initiatives in Europe to restore some of the capabilities that we withdrew from Europe at the end of the Cold War. Probably putting a brigade of tanks, armor brigade, pre-positioned stocks, in addition to the brigade that's now deployed on a rotational basis out of Poland and some other locations in Eastern Europe. So I think all of those are very real. And again, I think the proximate cause for this is the initiatives pursued by President Putin and the threats and so forth that are perceived, in many cases real. And it's hard to say what would happen at some point in time when President Putin steps down or passes on from the political scene. Obviously, it depends who replaces him, how that individual seeks to rule a country that, even though the price of oil and gas is substantially down from what it was before, is still capable of generating extraordinary revenue. I mean, it is still the #1 crude oil producer in the world. We will overtake them, I think, as we have overtaken them in production of natural gas. But still very much a resurgent great power, and one that must have been stung very badly by President Obama's description of Russia as a regional power. And I think Putin has been personally determined ever since to show that Russia still counts in the world. They've done it in Syria. They've done it in a variety of other relationships, now selling air defenses to Turkey, relationship with China, and so forth. And certainly in the case of Ukraine and others of their neighbors.
It's not a very optimistic place to leave it, but I think we should leave it there.
But it means there's so much work out there for the next generation.
Absolutely. So thanks to all of you, and special thanks to David.
My pleasure.